Almost unanimously, Halo 2 is considered to be the best game in the franchise. Everything great about Halo Combat Evolved is accentuated and enhanced in its sequel. Better visuals, better gameplay, better story, and Halo 2 essentially gave birth to the beginning of online matchmaking. Halo 2 is among one of the best games of all time due to it being a phenomenal game in its own right, but also the substantial cultural impact it created as well. The funny thing is though, Halo 2 almost didn't happen. In the mid-90s, Bungie was a very small company. Only consisting of about 15 people, this small studio saw fairly okay success with games such as Pathways into Darkness, Marathon, and Myth. However, after the release of Myth, Bungie wanted to try something different. Bungie began developing concepts that would be the natural extension of Marathon, their prior FPS title, with the development of a new science fiction real-time strategy game with a focus on realistic physics simulation and three-dimensional terrain. Beginning development around 1997, this RTS game, tentatively titled Armor, experimented with new ways of controlling units by attaching the camera directly to said units. The camera view progressively moved closer and closer as Bungie devs realized it was more fun for the player to actually drive the vehicles rather than simply point and click. By 98, the game, now unnamed because the title Armor was considered to be boring, dropped the RTS aspect and became a full-fledged third-person shooter. Then Executive Vice President of Bungie, Peter Tampt, was able to use his contacts in order to gain an audience with Steve Jobs, who was greatly impressed by the game and agreed to debut it at the 1999 Macworld Conference and Expo. Days before the conference, this unnamed game would finally receive a proper name in Halo. And on July 21st, 1999, Steve Jobs announced Halo to the world. A few years later, after a financial crisis resulting in Bungie being acquired by Microsoft, concept reworks from a story and gameplay standpoint, and insane amounts of crunch, Halo was a drastically different game compared to what was shown at Macworld. No longer was this a third-person open-world shooter, now Halo was a first-person shooter with a deep, complex story. On November 15th, 2001, Halo Combat Evolved was released to mass critical acclaim. Halo Combat Evolved revolutionized the gaming industry. Halo CE is often considered to be why the Xbox succeeded in the first place and why the FPS genre flourished on consoles. This was a monumental game in video game history. Halo was an absolute miracle, and after its mass success, Bungie got back to work developing its sequel. Interestingly enough, Halo Combat Evolved was supposed to be a one-and-done title. Halo as a whole was never meant to be a trilogy, or now an entology, I guess is what you would call it. But due to Combat Evolved's insane critical success, a sequel was expected, and soon after the release of Combat Evolved, its sequel, Halo 2, was announced to be in development at E3 2002. In developing the sequel, many Bungie devs wanted to make it by building off of scrapped ideas from Combat Evolved, with lead writer Joe Staten joking by saying, "Bungie's style is come up with an awesome idea, do not execute it on the first time around, save it, sit on it, hone it, refine it, then wham, next game realize it to its fullest potential." However, Bungie wasn't satisfied by simply adding back the things that were cut from the prior title. The team had to, as designer Jamie Griesmer stated, triple everything. The Halo 2 team rebuilt the entire game engine and physics engine, as well as developed a new way to render stencil shadows. Everything about Halo 2 was going to be bigger and better. However, the most important technical element of Halo 2 was its new and improved multiplayer. Using this newfangled thing called Xbox Live, this version of multiplayer would be quite different from its predecessor. Combat Evolved either had a classic split-screen multiplayer or a sort of LAN party thing where the players could connect their consoles together with network cables for group play. Combat Evolved was supposed to have larger maps to support multiple players, but the concept was scrapped and later resurrected with Halo 2. This Xbox Live would allow seamless connection over the World Wide Web, granting Bungie the ability to make these more grandiose maps and experiment with new ideas. The main takeaway and developmental thesis of Halo 2's multiplayer was simply fun first. Bungie wanted to bring couch multiplayer to online play and make multiplayer fun for low-skilled players, rather than catering to the competitive ones. On the flip side, Halo 2's story saw an even greater emphasis. Again, all the scrapped concepts and ideas from Combat Evolved gained a second chance with one massive narrative change, being that we would now see the war from the Covenant side. Halo 2's story would see us transition from playing as Master Chief to an elite known as the Arbiter. This would be a more personal story that explored concepts of betrayal as well as a deeper insight into the overarching lore of the universe. Bungie was very ambitious with their new game, and with more funding from Microsoft, Halo 2 was shaping up to be their best game yet. But here's the thing, despite all those great ideas, everything was not sunshine and rainbows behind the scenes. In watching the behind-the-scenes making of Halo 2 documentary, one would assume the development of said game was rather typical. Lots of hype, game comes along great, a few hiccups here and there, stress nearing the end, and boom, great final product with everyone happy. Not quite. Let's go back to the beginning. From the very start, if you were to ask any former Bungie employee what the main issue surrounding Halo 2's development was, they'd almost unanimously say there was a lack of leadership, the crunch was insane, and they bit off way more than they could chew. In Halo 2's infancy, conversations about the game happened in disconnected teams that didn't communicate with each other. Creative art director Marcus Lito would say, sadly, a lot of discussions at the beginning of Halo 2's development happened in insular little groups that didn't talk well with one another. And that was the crux of much of the conflict that would occur because we didn't have clear leadership. Because of this disconnected nature of Halo 2's development, each team had their own priorities that didn't necessarily jive well with everyone else's. Essentially, each team would dedicate their whole being to perfecting this one aspect of the game, and when they came up for air to talk to the other teams, they finally realized they weren't connecting. This disconnected nature of everything caused even further chaos as Bungie co-founder and project lead, Jason Jones, left the project midway through to work on another title, taking a substantial number of employees with him and leaving Halo 2 with a skeleton crew. Then, the other Bungie co-founder, Alex Serapin, would leave, resulting in even more chaos as he was described as the heart of Bungie. Things were not falling into place. And speaking of things falling apart, let's talk about crunch. Halo 2, much like Combat Evolved, suffered from tight deadlines resulting in crunch. For those of you who don't know what that term means, crunch refers to working over 50 hours a week on a title. Bungie devs did this for a year and a half. They'd come in bright and early in the morning and leave late at night. This cycle, obviously, resulted in multiple physical and mental issues plaguing the developers. According to some former Bungie devs, they wouldn't even see their families for days on end. Audio director Marty O'Donnell would later state, "The famous Halo 2 crunch was so bad. We had to renge on so many promises. And this is such a typical Bungie story, as it happens over and over again. We just couldn't deliver." And mission design lead Paul Bertone stated, "I slept at the office some obscene amount of days in a row. Like almost an entire month at the end. I kenneled my dog for almost 2 months. There would be mornings I'd wake up at home and not remember how I got there, and many others where I'd wake up at my desk or somebody else's. It was that way for a lot of people. A lot of relationships got fractured and felt irreparable at the time. The crunch and mismanagement had gotten so bad that the entire graphics engine had to be thrown out, and they had to do a complete redesign of the campaign about a year and a half in. Hell, even that famed Halo 2 E3 2003 demo that we all know and love was scrapped right after the show. Despite actually being playable, this version of the game used the prototype stencil lighting they'd been working on for nearly 2 years. And sure, it made the game look beautiful, but after the showcase, they finally realized that they couldn't ship the game with it, because that lighting engine was simply too much for the old Xbox, and there was no way they could have the entire game run on it. At this point, Bungie hit the emergency button and canceled Jason Jones's other project called Phoenix, and brought everyone back to work on Halo 2. However, at that point, the team was in a pretty deep hole, and it would be a long, grueling task of digging themselves out in order to ship the game. Marty O'Donnell would state, "When we realized that what we were going to be able to ship was a mess, we just had to change it. And so drastically, it was unbelievable." Because of this late development restart, the crunch and stress brought about by this game grew tenfold. And because of this grand restart, it resulted in a massive amount of content being cut. Out of any Halo game to date, Halo 2 had the most cut content, and I'd argue the most disheartening cuts. Let's start with the multiplayer. The original vision of Halo 2's multiplayer was something similar to Halo 5's Warzone, that being massive maps, tons of players, and AI in the middle. It was a PvPvE sort of thing. Interestingly enough, this was supposed to be in the original Halo, but was one of the things they revived and worked on in Halo 2. What's crazy though is that initially, that was the only multiplayer content they wanted for the game, as some devs wanted to outright scrap small arena-based multiplayer modes and split screen. The main voice against scrapping arena multiplayer was multiplayer designer Max Hoberman, who, after voicing his concerns, was placed in charge of developing it with a small team and zero resources. After about 6 months of being incredibly productive on the arena multiplayer, the big multiplayer mode had zero work being done on it, to the point where they just decided to scrap it and go with Hoberman's work. On the campaign side of things, many Bungie devs described its development as chaotic. Right off the bat, the main priority of the story was to explore a whole other world that wasn't all about Master Chief. In regards to the story concept, Joe Staten would say, "It was like, what if you are the guy who lost the Halo ring? What if you were the guy whose butt was on the line for protecting the most valuable religious object in the entire world, and you blew it?" For about 97% of Halo 2's development, this guy they were referring to was known as the Dervish. For those of you who don't know, the Dervish refers to a member of a Muslim religious order who has taken vows of poverty and austerity. Halo 2's Dervish would be this holy warrior, blessed by the gods, fighting for the Covenant. But then 9/11 happened, and the atmosphere surrounding Islam was very, shall we say, complicated. They ended up changing the title to the Arbiter to avoid potentially upsetting anyone. Regardless, the Dervish had been in place for so long that they had to cut out every instance of the word Dervish and re-record it with Arbiter, which was a long, tedious process. Yet this wasn't the only cut they had to make due to real-world influences. At one point during the campaign, the player would witness brutes decapitating Marines, but again, art was reflecting reality a bit too much for the time and they had to scrap it as well. Real-world implications aside, there were still a plethora of cuts to follow. While that would take an entire video in its own right to discuss, I just want to mention a few interesting cuts. After giving the Coveys back their bomb, there was a mission where Chief would be on the Covenant ship, blowing it up from the inside. Players would be able to rip turrets off their stands, the heretics were all supposed to be hunters, the drop pod sequence on Delta Halo was supposed to be in first person, and there was a whole mission where you'd be able to drive an awesome Forerunner tank, dodging the Gravemine's tentacles. While those are all really interesting in their own right, what I consider to be even more interesting are Halo 2's massive narrative cuts. This betrayal concept Halo 2 was working with was supposed to not only impact the Arbiter story, but also the Chiefs as well. Throughout the game, Master Chief would have been taking orders from Miranda Keyes, and after returning to her with some object from one mission, he'd find her speaking with the prophets. Apparently, she chose not to trust Chief, not only because he let her father die, but also because he was acting crazy about the ring going off. This scene would result in Chief being strapped with a nuke and forced to jump into a hole by ODSTs so they could kill Chief and the Gravemind with one bomb. In this original draft of the story, they wanted to explore more about the Flood itself, yet they ran into the issue because they couldn't figure out how to make them a race you cared about enough. Also, on Delta Halo, you'd be able to see more of the Gravemind's tendrils breaking through its surface. Chief would somehow get the nuke off, and we'd have the Gravemind cutscene where Chief and Arbiter get teleported. The game plays out the same, but after Arbiter kills Tartarus, the game doesn't end. That was simply the end of the second act. In fact, the whole third act was cut. Master Chief and the Arbiter would come together once more and go to Earth, do a Scarab trench run, and fight the Prophets on Earth on top of the excavated Ark. Essentially, a condensed version of Halo 3 takes place as the ending of Halo 2 and basically wraps up the story entirely, and there wouldn't be a follow-up. Not only this, but after saving the day and stopping the Covenant, the Arbiter would find the skeletal remains of a Forerunner and learn that the Forerunners were actually ancient humans. There were multiple rewrites of Halo 2, and this was just one of them. And while I only really summarized this lost third act, I highly recommend checking out C3 Sabertooth's video on the subject, as he goes into far more detail than I did and actually shows animated storyboards of this alternate ending. So definitely go check that out. Like always, link in the description. Anyhow, Halo 2 eventually got its shit together and put together a functioning game with an actual concrete story, and after even more crunch, Halo 2 was released on November 9th, 2004. Much to Bungie's surprise, Halo 2, just like Combat Evolved, was released to critical acclaim. The hype for this game was at an all-time high, with a record of 1.5 million copies being pre-ordered 3 weeks before release. The game ended up selling 2.4 million copies and earned over $125 million in its first 24 hours on store shelves. Halo 2 was also the most popular video game on Xbox Live, holding that rank until the release of Gears of War almost 2 years later. In the first 10 weeks of release, players collectively logged 91 million hours, and by June 2006, more than 500 million games of Halo 2 had been played and more than 710 million hours logged on Xbox Live. Critics claimed Halo 2 was a worthy successor to Combat Evolved, with the main criticism being that the game's campaign was too short and they didn't like the cliffhanger ending. Halo 2 ended up winning many awards, including Console Game of the Year, Outstanding Achievement in Online Gameplay, and Best Shooter, Sound Effects, and Original Music, just to name a few. The Bungie devs seemingly did the impossible. They made a bigger and better Halo just like they wanted. Despite all the accolades, behind the scenes, it's a somber tale. Bungie was just happy they were finally done with this game and could actually see their families again, and no one was really happy with what they had made. Jamie Griesmer would also say, Halo 2 was a shell of a game in a lot of ways. Some of Halo 2 was great, but we had to kill ourselves to get it done. What's the phrase? Putting 10 pounds of shit into a 5-pound bag? We really tried to cram it too full, and we paid the price. Joe Staten stated, we were driven by the strong desire to outdo ourselves, but we didn't fully understand our limitations, and it was a hard process to admit to ourselves that we couldn't do everything. We just plowed ahead, much like we'd done with Halo, with one notable exception. We ordered ourselves a giant sandwich, took a bite, but didn't realize exactly how big it was before we started in. And we did that across the board, technically, artistically, and story-wise. But of course, we didn't figure that out until it was too late. And Paul Bertone stated, it was basically a death march to the end. Nobody will say anything different, and if they do, they're just trying to sugarcoat it. Just a death march. No one from Bungie thought anyone would actually play Halo 2, let alone praise it, especially its story. Yet a few years later, Halo 3 would be released, and most, if not all of the cut content from Halo 2 would be re-implemented. The excavated arc on Earth, the big scarab battle, kinda sorta confirming humans are Forerunners, and the end of the Covenant. I'm actually glad it turned out this way. Cramming all of that into one final act in Halo 2 would have felt, to me, extremely rushed. Splitting it up into 2 games also gave Bungie time to develop the conclusion of Halo on the next-gen hardware of the Xbox 360. Halo 3 gave the conclusion room to breathe and allowed it to be created on new technology. Despite all the long nights, cut content, and rightfully disheartened developers, I and many fans still love Halo 2. For all its shortcomings, I still feel like Bungie delivered on the promise to make a fantastic game, one that will live on in the memories of fans forever.